I'll write a detailed 900-word expansion of Part 1, in third-person style using simple English. Here's the expanded story. Mrs. Eleanor Wilson sat in her favorite armchair by the window, watching the rain tap against the glass. The soft light of her reading lamp cast a warm glow across her living room. At 72, Eleanor's face showed the gentle lines of a life well lived. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands, though marked with age spots, remained steady as she turned. The pages of her book, Max, her German shepherd, lay at her feet. His ears suddenly perked up, and he raised his head, looking toward the back door. Eleanor paused her reading, listening carefully. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but there was something else, a sound that didn't belong to the night. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, reaching down to stroke his graying muzzle. Max stood up, his aging body still showing the alertness of his police training. 7 years on the force had taught him to recognize danger. Since retiring, due to a leg injury, he had found a new purpose as Eleanor's companion. The brick house at the end of Oak Street had been Eleanor's home for 45 years. Robert, her husband, had painted the shutters blue the summer after they married. He had planted the rose bushes that still bloomed in the garden. 2 years ago, cancer had taken him quickly, leaving Eleanor alone in the house filled with memories. Max had come into her life 6 months after Robert's passing. The police department had a program for retiring service dogs, and Eleanor's nephew William, a police officer himself, had suggested the match. "He needs a home, Aunt Eleanor," William had said, "and I think you need him too." From their first day together, Eleanor and Max had formed a bond that grew stronger with each passing week. Every morning, they walked through Millfield Village, following the same path through the park. Eleanor would stop to chat with neighbors, while Max waited patiently, his intelligent brown eyes watching everyone who approached. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," Thomas from the bakery would call out, waving from behind the counter of his shop. "Max looking handsome today. Got a fresh bun for him right here." Eleanor was known throughout Millfield for her kindness. She baked scones for the church fundraiser every month, visited sick neighbors, and always remembered children's birthdays with small, thoughtful gifts. Her modest home sat on a corner lot that had been in her family for 3 generations. Her grandfather had built the original cottage, and Robert had expanded it when they learned they were expecting a child. Though their daughter now lived in London with her own family, the house remained filled with happy memories. The first signs of trouble had appeared 3 weeks ago. Eleanor had noticed unfamiliar men in business suits walking slowly past her house. They carried clipboards and took photos of her property. They never spoke to her directly, but their presence felt intrusive. Max seemed to sense her discomfort, staying closer to her side than usual during their walks. Last Tuesday, while Eleanor was pruning her roses, a sleek black car had parked across the street. The driver, a man in an expensive suit, watched her house for nearly an hour before driving away. When Eleanor mentioned this to her neighbor, Mary Thompson, Mary frowned. "The Johnsons down the street sold their house last month," Mary said, "and the Barkers before them. Some big company buying up properties, offering good money, they say." That evening, as Eleanor prepared Max's dinner, the telephone rang. She wiped her hands on her apron before answering. "Mrs. Wilson," said a smooth, confident voice. "My name is James Bennett. I represent Oakwood Developments. We're interested in purchasing your property. We are prepared to make a generous offer." Eleanor felt her heart beat faster. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett," she replied politely. "My house isn't for sale." "Perhaps you'd like to hear the amount before deciding," he pressed. "Many of your neighbors have already accepted our offers." "This home has been in my family for generations," Eleanor explained. "It holds too many memories to sell." "I understand sentiment, Mrs. Wilson," Bennett said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "But you should consider the practical aspects. A woman your age living alone in such a large house, it must be difficult to maintain." "I manage just fine, thank you," Eleanor said firmly. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett." The calls continued over the next week, becoming less friendly each time. Yesterday, Bennett had suggested that the neighborhood was changing and might not be safe for an elderly woman living alone. "I'm not alone," Eleanor had told him before hanging up. "I have Max." Now as rain tapped against her windows, Eleanor closed her book and looked at Max, still alert and focused on the back door. Something wasn't right. The dog's behavior brought back memories of Robert saying that animals sense things humans miss. Eleanor stood up slowly, her knees stiff from sitting. "Come on, boy," she whispered. "Let's check the doors." Max followed close behind as Eleanor moved through the dim hallway. The tick of the grandfather clock seemed unusually loud in the quiet house. Outside, a branch scraped against the window, making Eleanor jump. Max pressed against her leg, a solid, reassuring presence. As they reached the kitchen, Max suddenly froze, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine as she heard, unmistakably this time, the sound of someone trying. The handle of her back door. Morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains as Eleanor Wilson stood in her garden, staring at the trampled flowers. Her rose bushes, the ones Robert had planted, lay crushed beneath heavy footprints. The wooden garden gnome that had stood by the gate for 20 years was smashed to pieces. Her mailbox hung sideways on its post, the metal dented as if someone had struck it repeatedly. Max sniffed the damaged area, his tail stiff and ears alert. Eleanor felt a tightness in her chest as she surveyed the destruction. This was not random vandalism. This was a message. "Come on, boy," she said to Max. "We need to report this." The police station in Millfield was a small brick building on High Street. Constable William Baker had served the village for 30 years and had known Eleanor since she first moved to Oak Street as a young bride. His kind face showed concern as Eleanor described the damage. "Probably just teenagers," he said with a sympathetic smile, jotting notes in his worn notebook. "Happened to the Richardsons last month too. Kids get bored around here." "It wasn't teenagers, William," Eleanor said firmly. "It's that development company. They've been calling, pressuring me to sell my house." Constable Baker looked up from his notes. "Oakwood. They've bought half the properties on Oak Street already." "Good. Money, from what I hear. They can offer all the money in the world. I'm not selling." William's expression softened. "Not much we can do without evidence, Eleanor. No witnesses, no fingerprints. I'll drive by your place more often this week. Keep an eye out." As Eleanor and Max walked home, she felt eyes watching her. Across the street, a man in a dark suit sat in a parked car pretending to read a newspaper. Max growled softly, sensing her unease. That afternoon, the telephone rang again. Eleanor hesitated before answering. "Mrs. Wilson," the now familiar voice of James Bennett said, "have you reconsidered our offer?" "After what you did to my garden?" "Certainly not." A pause. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Wilson." "My flowers are destroyed. My mailbox damaged. Don't pretend you weren't involved." Bennett's voice turned cold. "You should be careful making accusations, Mrs. Wilson. You're alone in that big house. Accidents happen to elderly people all the time." The line went dead. Eleanor's hand shook as she placed the receiver down. Max nudged her leg gently, and she bent to stroke his fur. "We'll be all right," she whispered, though she didn't quite believe it. The next morning, Eleanor was weeding what remained of her garden when Mary Thompson called over the fence. "Everything all right, love?" Mary asked, her round face creased with concern. "Saw your garden. Terrible business." Eleanor straightened slowly, her back stiff from bending. "Just feeling a bit unsafe," she admitted. "Some people want my house very badly." Mary clicked her tongue in sympathy. "Those Oakwood people. They've been after my Peter too, offering silly money, but where would we go? Been here 40 years. "Exactly," Eleanor nodded. "This is home." "You should stay with me for a few days," Mary offered. "Peter wouldn't mind. Not safe. You being alone with all this going on." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "This is my home. Robert built this house. With his own hands. I won't be frightened away." But as days passed, Eleanor found herself jumping at small noises. She checked the locks twice each night and kept the telephone within reach. The development company's calls continued, each one more threatening than the last. "Think about it, Mrs. Wilson," Bennett had said yesterday. "A woman your age shouldn't be worrying about property maintenance. Our retirement communities have excellent security." That evening, as darkness fell earlier than usual with gathering storm clouds, Eleanor sat in her living room, knitting a scarf for her granddaughter's birthday. The radio played softly, an old program of classical music that Robert had loved. Max lay at her feet, occasionally lifting his head when cars passed by. The storm broke around 8 o'clock, rain lashing against the windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Eleanor counted the seconds between lightning and thunder, just as she'd taught her daughter to do years ago. 1, 2, 3, 4. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by a deafening crack. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. Max stood up immediately, his body tense. Eleanor reached for the torch she kept in the side table drawer, her hand trembling slightly. "It's all right, Max," she whispered, though her heart raced. "Just the storm." But Max wasn't looking at the windows. His attention was fixed on the back door, a low growl building in his throat. Eleanor clicked on the torch, its beam seeming feeble against the deep shadows. From outside came the sound of footsteps on the gravel path leading to her back door. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't retreat from the storm, but advanced purposefully toward her house. Eleanor rose to her feet, one hand clutching the torch, the other reaching for the telephone. The line was dead, of course it was. This wasn't a coincidence. The power cut, the dead phone line, the footsteps approaching her isolated house during a storm. Someone had planned this carefully. "Come, Max," she whispered. Together, they moved into the hallway. Max positioned himself between Eleanor and the back door, his training evident in every line of his body. Through the thin curtain covering the door's window, Eleanor could see the outline of a man. Then another. They were trying to be quiet, but she could hear the metallic scraping of tools working at her lock. Eleanor's mind raced. The front door was too far. They would see her if she tried to escape that way. The neighbors were too distant to hear calls for help over the storm. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. Then she remembered something William had told her when Max first came to live with her. "He remembers all his commands," William had said, "though I hope you'll never need to use them." Eleanor placed a steady hand on Max's head. Despite her fear, she felt suddenly calm, focused. They weren't going to chase her from her home, not tonight, not ever. The back door rattled. Eleanor stood frozen in the darkness, her torch beam fixed on the door. The wind howled outside, rain pelting against the windows, yet she could clearly hear the metal scraping of tools working at her lock. Max moved silently to her side, his aging body transforming as instinct and training took over. His ears pointed forward, muscles tense, ready. "Remember your training, boy," Eleanor whispered, stroking his head once. She moved toward the hallway. Phone, hoping against hope that the line had somehow been restored. Before she could reach it, the lock gave way with a snap, and the door burst open. 3 men entered, their faces partially hidden by pulled-down caps. Water dripped from their rain-soaked jackets onto her clean kitchen floor. Eleanor's torch illuminated their faces, just enough for her to recognize the tallest one. "Mrs. Wilson," the man said, removing his cap, revealing himself as James Bennett. His voice was the same smooth tone she had heard on the telephone, though now it carried a note of triumph. "We're here to discuss your property situation." Eleanor steadied the torch, keeping it aimed at his face. "Breaking into my home is hardly a proper business meeting," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Bennett glanced around the kitchen, taking in the old-fashioned cupboards and the photos on the wall. "Power cut is unfortunate timing," he said with a slight smile. "But perhaps it's for the best. No distractions while we talk." The second man, shorter and broader, stepped forward. Water pooled beneath his boots on the linoleum floor. "Is the old lady going to be reasonable now?" he asked Bennett, speaking, as if Eleanor wasn't even there. "I think Mrs. Wilson understands the situation better now," Bennett replied. He turned to Eleanor, his expression hardening. "The company needs your land. We've already bought every other house on this street. You're being difficult for no reason." Eleanor felt Max press against her leg. She had positioned herself so the men couldn't see him clearly in the shadows. "My husband and I built this house," Eleanor said, proud that her voice didn't waver. "Our memories are in these walls. It's not for sale at any price." "Listen to me," Bennett said, his polite business tone slipping. "This development is happening whether you like it or not. The paperwork is signed. Construction starts next month. Your house is sitting right in the middle of what will be the new shopping centre's main entrance." The third man, who had remained silent by the door, spoke up. "Boss, let's just get her to sign and be done with it. I don't like this." His eyes darted nervously around the darkened kitchen. "Shut up, Parker," Bennett snapped. He turned back to Eleanor. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign these papers." He pulled folded documents from his coat pocket. "In return, we'll set you up in a nice retirement flat in town, better than you could afford otherwise." "And if I refuse?" Eleanor asked quietly. The second man moved closer, his wet boots squeaking on the floor. "Look, old lady, we tried to be reasonable. Now we'll make sure you understand how dangerous it is for someone your age to live alone." He reached out to grab Eleanor's arm. In that moment, she saw not just the threat to herself, but to everything she held dear: her home, her memories, her independence. She saw Robert's face the day they'd planted those rose bushes, heard his laughter echoing through these rooms, felt the decades of love embedded in these walls. Eleanor stood tall, her dignity unbroken. She lowered the torch slowly, letting darkness partially conceal her movements. "I'm not alone," she said quietly, and whistled sharply, a command signal she had learned from William, a signal Max remembered from his police training. From the shadows beside her, Max emerged. He was no longer the gentle companion who dozed by the fire. The German shepherd transformed before their eyes, 7 years of police training surging through his aging body. A deep, menacing growl filled the room as he positioned himself between Eleanor and the intruders. The second man froze, his hand still outstretched. "What the—" "This is Max," Eleanor said calmly. "He served with the police force for 7 years, specialized in taking down armed suspects. He still remembers his training." Bennett's face drained of color as he stared at the dog. In the beam of Eleanor's torch, Max's teeth gleamed white, his dark eyes locked on the men. Another growl rumbled from his chest, deeper and more threatening than the first. "Call it off," Bennett demanded, his confident tone replaced by uncertainty. "Call the dog off now." "Why should I?" Eleanor asked. "You broke into my home. You threatened me. I think Max is responding appropriately, don't you?" The third man, Parker, backed toward the door. "I didn't sign up for this, Bennett. You said she was just some helpless old woman." "Shut up," Bennett hissed, but his eyes never left Max. The dog took one step forward, muscles coiled and ready to spring. Eleanor felt a strange calm descend over her. For weeks these men had made her feel vulnerable, afraid in her own home. But now, with Max at her side, she recognized her own strength. She'd lived through war, through loss, through grief. She would not be intimidated in the home she had shared with Robert. "Max, hold," she commanded, using the word William had taught her. The dog stopped advancing but remained alert, a low growl continuing to rumble in his chest. "Now," Eleanor said to Bennett, "I believe you gentlemen were just leaving." Bennett's eyes darted between Eleanor and Max. "This isn't over," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. "Oh, I think it is," Eleanor replied. She reached slowly for the kitchen counter, finding the old-fashioned telephone. "I'm going to call Constable Baker now. You can explain to him why you broke into my home." The men exchanged glances. All three began backing toward the door. "This is a mistake, Mrs. Wilson," Bennett said. "The development is happening. You can't stop progress." "Perhaps not," Eleanor agreed, "but I can stop you from taking my home. Now get out before I give Max a different command." The men retreated through the door, stumbling in their haste. Eleanor heard their footsteps crunching rapidly down the gravel path. Only when the sound had faded did she allow her shoulders to sag slightly. Max looked up at her, awaiting further instructions. "Good boy," she whispered, kneeling despite her stiff joints to wrap her arms around his neck. "The very best boy." Phew. Men froze like statues, their eyes wide with shock. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not from a retired police dog who moved with such purpose and authority. Max's growl filled the darkened kitchen, his teeth bared in warning. The storm continued to rage outside, rain lashing against the windows. But inside the house, time seemed suspended in that moment of confrontation. "Call him off," Bennett shouted, backing toward the door. His voice had lost all its smooth confidence, replaced by naked fear. Get that animal away from me! Max, hold, Eleanor commanded calmly, using police terminology she had learned from William. The dog stood his ground, eyes locked on the intruders, his body positioned to prevent their escape. Though his muzzle showed grey and his joints weren't as quick as in his prime, Max's training was evident in every line of his body. Bennett pressed himself against the wall, as far from Max as he could manage in the small kitchen. The second man, burly and red-faced, looked ready to make a run for it, but Max shifted slightly, a warning rumble coming from deep in his chest. The message was clear: no one was leaving. With a steady hand that surprised even herself, Eleanor reached for the telephone on the wall. The storm had knocked out the power, but the old landline still worked. She dialed Constable Baker's direct number, one she had known by heart for decades. "William," she said when he answered, her voice remarkably steady. "There are 3 men from Oakwood Developments who've broken into my home. They've threatened me. Max has them cornered." "Max?" Baker's voice crackled with surprise. "Your dog?" "Yes, Max. My retired police dog, the one you gave me." Eleanor kept her eyes on the intruders as she spoke. "They broke in during the power cut. Said they wanted to make me understand how dangerous it is for someone my age to live alone." "Don't move," Baker said urgently. "I'm on my way with backup." As Eleanor replaced the receiver, she noticed the youngest man, barely more than a boy really, trembling against the wall. His face was pale in the beam of her torch, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the room. "You don't understand," Bennett said, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is a misunderstanding. We only came to talk about the property by breaking in during a storm." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "After threatening me on the phone, after destroying my garden?" The young man's eyes darted nervously between Bennett and Eleanor. Max growled again, and suddenly the young man broke. "It wasn't just vandalism," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "Bennett paid us to scare you, the broken mailbox, the trampled garden. Said a bit of pressure would make you sign. The company's losing millions because you won't sell. They need your land for the main entrance to the shopping center." Bennett's face contorted with fury. "Shut up, Parker," he hissed. "Not another word." "But it's gone too far," Parker continued, his words tumbling out. "Breaking in, threatening. This isn't right. I just needed the money for university." Bennett lunged toward Parker, but Max was faster. The German shepherd moved like lightning, placing himself between the men, his warning bark echoing in the small kitchen. Bennett froze again, all color draining from his face. "Don't move," Eleanor said quietly. "Max was trained to take down suspects. He still remembers how." Minutes ticked by in tense silence. The rain began to ease outside, and distant sirens grew, louder. Max never relaxed his vigilant stance, his eyes moving between the 3 men, watching for any threatening movement. Headlights swept across the kitchen window as police cars pulled into Eleanor's driveway. Car doors slammed, and footsteps crunched on the gravel path. A moment later, Constable William Baker burst through the already broken door, followed by 2 younger officers. They stopped short at the scene before them. 3 men pressed against the wall, faced down by an elderly German shepherd. "Good Lord," Baker breathed, taking in the scene. He spotted Eleanor standing calmly by the phone, torch still in hand. "Are you hurt, Eleanor?" "I'm fine, William," she replied, "thanks to Max." Baker approached slowly, recognizing the dog from his years on the force. "Good boy, Max," he said softly. "Still serving and protecting, I see." At the sound of his former colleague's voice, Max's ears twitched, but he maintained his position until Eleanor gave him a release command. "It's all right now, Max. Stand down." Only then did the dog relax his stance, moving back to Eleanor's side but keeping a watchful eye on the intruders. The officers moved forward, handcuffs ready. As they secured the 3 men, Baker jotted notes in his book while Parker continued. His nervous confession. "The company's been doing this all over," he explained, "buying up houses, using pressure tactics when people won't sell, but Mrs. Wilson was the last holdout." Bennett, now handcuffed, glared at Parker. "You're finished," he spat. "The company's lawyers will destroy you." "I think the company will be more concerned with the breaking and entering charges," Baker said mildly. "Not to mention the threats and vandalism. Might be interested to know how many of their practices were legal." He closed his notebook with a snap. "Take them to the station," he instructed the other officers. As the men were led out into the night, Baker turned to Eleanor. "You're one brave lady, Mrs. Wilson. Not many would stand their ground like you did." Eleanor smiled, kneeling despite her stiff joints to stroke Max's fur as he relaxed from his guard position. The dog leaned against her leg, his tail wagging, slowly transformed once more into her gentle companion. "We protect each other, don't we, boy?" she said softly. Max looked up at her, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand every word. Baker helped Eleanor to her feet. "I'll have someone come board up that door tonight. First thing tomorrow, we'll get it properly fixed." He glanced around the kitchen. "Don't suppose you'd consider staying with someone tonight? Mary Thompson, perhaps?" Eleanor shook her head. "This is my home, William. I'm not leaving it. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I have the best protection in Millfield right here." As Baker nodded in understanding, the lights suddenly flickered back on. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear night sky visible through the window. Eleanor looked around her familiar kitchen, now brightly lit, and felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. This house, with all its memories of Robert, of raising their daughter, of a lifetime of love, it remained hers, safe and protected. Max nudged her hand with his nose, bringing her back to the present moment. She scratched behind his ears exactly where he liked it best. "Yes," she whispered, "we'll be just fine now." The story of Eleanor and Max's bravery spread through Millfield like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew how an elderly woman and her retired police dog had stood against 3 intruders and won. The village buzzed with the tale, each telling adding new details until Eleanor hardly recognized the story herself. The local newspaper, the Millfield Chronicle, ran a front-page story with the bold headline, "Elderly Woman and Retired Police Dog Expose Property Scheme." The article detailed how Oakwood Developments had been using intimidation tactics to force residents to sell their homes. The reporter, a young woman named Emily, interviewed Eleanor in her living room while Max sat proudly at her feet. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," Eleanor told her, pouring tea into delicate cups that had belonged to her mother. "I was just protecting my home." After the article appeared, something unexpected happened. Neighbors who had already sold their properties to Oakwood came forward with similar stories of intimidation. The Johnsons described threatening phone calls. The Barkers showed evidence of property damage that occurred just before they agreed to sell. Suddenly, what had seemed like isolated incidents formed a clear pattern of harassment. The police investigation expanded. Documents were seized. From Oakwood's offices, Bennett and his associates faced not just breaking and entering charges, but conspiracy and extortion as well. 2 weeks later, Eleanor sat on her newly repaired porch with Max beside her. The morning sun warmed her face as she looked out at her garden. The trampled flowers had been replaced with fresh plants, courtesy of village volunteers who had appeared at her door the previous weekend, trowels and seedlings in hand. Thomas from the bakery had organized the effort. "Can't have our local hero living with a ruined garden," he had said with a grin. Mary Thompson crossed the street, carrying a tray covered with a checkered cloth. As she climbed the porch steps, the smell of fresh-baked scones filled the air. "Thought you might fancy some tea and biscuits," Mary said, setting the tray on the small table between their chairs. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Eleanor nodded, watching as Mary poured steaming tea into 2 cups. Max thumped his tail against the wooden porch floor, recognizing a friend. "The whole village is talking about you two," Mary said, passing Eleanor a cup. "They're calling you the guardian angels of Millfield. Mrs. Parker at the post office says her son was led astray by that Bennett fellow. The boys agreed to testify against the company." Eleanor took a sip of tea before responding. "We're just looking out for our home," she said simply. She didn't feel like a hero or an angel. She had only done what anyone would do to protect what they loved. The sound of a car pulling up made them both look up. Constable Baker stepped out, his uniform crisp in the morning light. He climbed the steps, declining tea with a shake of his head. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, removing his hat. "Bennett and his associates are facing serious charges. The development's been halted pending investigation. Seems the company didn't have all the proper permits anyway." Eleanor nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. The thought of her neighbors' homes being demolished to make way for a shopping center had pained her deeply. "But that's not all," Baker continued, a smile breaking across his usually serious face. "We've started a neighborhood watch program. Several retired folks have signed up already. Your name's at the top of the list if you're interested." Eleanor found herself nodding before she'd even considered it. The idea of helping keep her community safe appealed to her. "And there's something else," Baker added. "The police department wants to recognize Max with an honorary medal. Chief's idea. Says a dog who remembers his training years after retirement deserves recognition." At the sound of his name, Max lifted his head, looking between Eleanor and the constable with intelligent. Just 1 week later, Eleanor stood in the village square, dressed in her best blue dress and hat. Max sat beside her, freshly bathed and wearing a new collar. It seemed the entire village had turned out for the ceremony. Children sat cross-legged at the front of the crowd, eager to see the hero dog receive his medal. The police chief, a tall man with a grey moustache, spoke about courage and community. Eleanor only half listened, her attention caught by the faces in the crowd. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years without really knowing each other now stood together, chatting and smiling. The Parkers were there too, the young man who had confessed standing awkwardly with his parents, his future uncertain but his conscience clear. When the chief called Max forward, Eleanor walked beside him to the small platform. The medal, a simple disc engraved with the words "for bravery," was attached to Max's collar while the crowd applauded. Max, seeming to understand the honor, sat perfectly still, his posture straight and proud. Looking around at the gathered community, Eleanor realized something had changed. What had begun as a frightening ordeal had transformed the village. Neighbors who barely spoke before now checked on each other regularly. The threat from Oakwood had brought them together, reminding them of the importance of community. As autumn, leaves began to fall around them. Eleanor and Max took their usual walk through the park each morning, but now their routine included stops to chat with neighbors. Children ran up to pet the hero dog, and elderly neighbors nodded in respect. "Hello, Mrs. Wilson," called young Thomas from the bakery, waving from across the street. "Lovely day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is," Eleanor replied with a smile. That evening, as darkness fell, Eleanor and Max sat by the fire in the cozy living room of the house Robert had built. She worked on her knitting while Max dozed at her feet, occasionally opening one eye to check on her. "We found our purpose again, didn't we?" Eleanor whispered to Max, reaching down to stroke his fur. "Sometimes the strongest protection comes from those society underestimates most." Max thumped his tail against the floor in agreement. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windows. But inside, all was warm and safe. Through courage and loyalty, they had not only protected their home, but had helped build a stronger community, proving that age diminishes neither strength nor purpose when hearts remain brave. The end.